et à tous. On se retrouve aujourd'hui pour un séminaire les pratiques médiatiques alternatives dans les manifestations en Inde. Et on est très heureux d'accueillir aujourd'hui Sangeeta Menon et Benjamin Ferron, que je présenterai dans quelques minutes. Pour commencer, il me semble important de rappeler que dans le cadre d'un mouvement social, de lutte politique, les enjeux de prise de parole publique, de formulation des revendications, de lutte des définitions sont centraux, particulièrement lorsque sont engagés des groupes sociaux dominés face à une parole officielle, institutionnelle, qui a accès et qui participe à la structuration des canaux d'expression légitimes et qui, dans ce rapport de force symbolique, tend notamment à naturaliser ses propres discours, notamment par le biais de la disqualification des paroles et représentations sociales contestataires. Ceci étant dit, on peut s'interroger de différentes manières, mais notamment sur les différents moyens et outils qui sont mis en place dans le cadre de mobilisation sociale, qu'ils soient internes ou périphériques au mouvement. Et évidemment, l'émergence, la structuration de médias alternatifs et les manières dont ils participent à la définition des intérêts sociaux des groupes protestataires. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, on est très heureux d'accueillir Sangeeta Menon. Vous êtes doctorante depuis 2022 à l'Institute for Creative Futures de l'Université de Loughborough à Londres. Vous avez été aussi journaliste, vous êtes diplômée en journalisme et en communication. Et vos recherches, elles s'inscrivent donc dans le champ des études sur les médias alternatifs que vous travaillez à caractériser, à définir. Et puis, vous étudiez aussi les stratégies, mais ce n'est pas que les pratiques, disons, communicationnelles des mouvements sociaux en lien avec les pratiques justement médiatiques alternatives qui émergent notamment en 2020 en Inde, au travers du mouvement des Kishan Andolan, qui sont des mouvements protestataires paysans qui contestent en fait 3 lois agraires néolibérales dans un contexte de détresse accrue des agriculteurs, des travailleurs agricoles, mais aussi des petits propriétaires terriens. Et donc ce mouvement paysan, il a réuni dans la lutte des groupes socio-culturels, socio-religieux très hétérogènes, et à mobiliser des répertoires d'actions collectives composites très différents également, mais vous en parlerez mieux que moi. Et donc, pour faire suite à cette présentation, Benjamin Ferron, tu es maître de conférences en sciences de l'information et de la communication, docteur en sciences politiques, sociologue, tu t'es spécialisé en sociologie des médias, du journalisme et des mouvements sociaux, et tu as notamment axé tes recherches sur les médias alternatifs et les stratégies d'accès aux médias des mouvements sociaux, et tu as publié en octobre dernier l'ouvrage « La communication des mouvements sociaux ». So now let's get started by listening to Sangeeta for her presentation on alternative media practices in farmers' protest in India.
Thank you, Léna. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, first of all, thank you, Benjamin, for having me here, inviting me to Céditec. And I'm really honored to be able to speak to all of you and bring early insights from my research into this space and to get feedback from all of you. Thank you, Léna, for supporting this process, for helping me get here and organizing this event. So yeah, so the title of today's presentation is Mediating the Collective, and I'm looking at alternative media practices in the Indian farmers' protest. These protests took place in India from 2020 of November to 2021 December, ran a full year long. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm a PhD candidate at Loughborough University, London, where I'm, like I said earlier, I'm studying alternative media and social movements at Loughborough University's London campus. I'm part of the Institute for Creative Futures. While I do my PhD, I'm also working as a volunteer editor with an alternative media. And I see that constant exchange happening between my research and my practice. I've also spent considerable amount of time in industry looking at marketing and communication roles. Began my career as a journalist in the 90s in India. And I also grew up in the Indian labor movement, being born to a trade union leader. who was committed to his activism all his life. So we grew up in that kind of an environment. So, and I believe all of these experiences inform in some way my research and why I decided this topic. So in terms of today's presentation, like I said earlier, I'm looking at just sharing some of the initial findings from my ongoing PhD research on the role of alternative media in the Indian farmers' protest. I'm specifically focusing on for this research, I'm looking at 3 publications: Karti Dharti, Trolley Times, and People's Archive of Rural India. So what I share today is based on, it is developed from my fieldwork last year in India. I conducted semi-structured interviews with alternative media actors from these 3 publications. There were 24 interviews in all with 23 media actors, semi-structured interviews which ran from 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours each. And I'm also looking at, that's one part of my data. The other part of my data is content that was published by these publications, these 3 publications during the months from January to May 2021. I'm looking at those months. So I'm conducting in terms of how I've arrived at these findings that I'm sharing today is I've conducted thematic analysis on the interviews and the content that was published that runs into over 100 articles. Still working my way through some of that data. So it's a parallel process. I'm looking at the data, writing a bit, then going back to the data. It's kind of, yeah. So what I'm trying to understand specifically for today is also what I'm going to share is how I looked at what are the communicative aims of these 3 media, what were they trying to do, what was their role really, what were they trying to do with their journalism in the movement that happened in India. And I think I'm curious to understand what are some of the practices, what are the alternative journalism practices that I can delineate from these organizations and their work. So that, in a nutshell, is what today's talk is going to be like. I think before I get into the actual protests, it's important to kind of set the context of why the protests happened, what was the protest all about. And so the protests mainly were in response to 3 farm laws that were framed as agricultural reforms by the government and introduced, brought in as ordinances in June 2020 by the Indian government. They were pushed through Parliament later as laws in September 2020. And of course, it was criticized because it didn't follow democratic kind of norms. There was no discussion. There was no discussion either with the stakeholders, which are the farmers and the farm unions. There was no discussion with within the Parliament as well. It was also the farm laws were also brought in when India was just coming to grips with the COVID-19 and the after effects of a severe lockdown, which saw, I'm sure you've seen some of those visuals of the migration of people from the villages, from the cities, the reverse migration to the villages. So there was a lot India was grappling with, and that's when the farm laws were introduced. So 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 those are the 3 farm laws that were brought in. This is the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020. And I quote Professor Jodka here, who's explained these laws quite well. And he says the first law liberalizes sale and purchase of agricultural commodities, specifically of food grains. It undermines the pre-existing marketing framework and opens up the trading of food grains outside the agricultural produce marketing committees, or APMCs, that were put in place by many state governments as part of a supporting structure for the surplus producing farmers during the Green Revolution, which began in the late 1960s and early 1970s in India. Yeah, so it also the new law also does away with, importantly, does away with reference to existing minimum price guarantees that were produced that were given to farmers, which was which was seen as a hard blow on farmers who were already going through a lot of distress with climate change, with crashing prices of crops. The second law is the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act 2020. I quote Professor Jodhka again, where he says that the law proposes a framework for contract farming, where farmers can directly enter into agreements with the buyer to produce a specific crop to be purchased at a prefixed price. Basically, it took away all supports from the government. It took away, in addition to the price security, it also didn't offer a proper redressal system if there was a dispute between the producer, between the farmer and the buyer. So it made the farmers that much more. It put them in a very vulnerable position with the buyer. So the third law, the Essential Commodities Amendment Act 2020, was an amendment to an existing law, which was essential to maintain India's food security. It was as Professor Jodhka reminds us, these measures were meant to ensure that India did not again experience famines, which had been a perpetual feature of the British colonial period. So the amendment to the law would remove the ceilings or the limits on private traders from hoarding, from storing excess amounts of food grains and pulses, cereals, oil seeds, which were earlier considered as essential commodities, but were no longer to be considered essential commodities. What it would mean then, which the farmers and the movement reminded us, is that it would eventually affect everyone, not just the farmer, because the prices of food would go up once there are no such controls. So, so to put it briefly, what the three laws would do is it would open the doors for corporate takeover of agriculture, introduce corporate contract farming, dismantle familiar systems of procurement, remove controls on hoarding of essential commodities. So, so these are the laws that kind of trigger the movement. It started with local protests and mobilizations happening around Punjab as early as I say July, August here. It began as early as July 2021, and then it kept this whole process of conscientization happened. Farm union leaders were traveling across the states, talking to people, mobilizing. So that process went on, and in November 2020, the Samyukt Kisan Morcha, I haven't mentioned that here, I think. The Samyukt Kisan Morcha was formed, which was a coalition of 40 farm unions, brought together 40 large farm unions to kind of steer and guide the future of the movement. There was a call. There was a call given in November to march to Delhi on November 26th, Delhi being the capital of India. And as the farmers marched towards Delhi, they were, however, denied entry into the capital. Following this, they decided to then just camp on the borders of Delhi, creating the largest peaceful democratic protest that contemporary India has seen. Yeah, just to add what the protest like, and of course, it was non-violent. It ran for a whole year until from November 26th, 2020 to December 11, 2021. And the government finally repealed the laws. That was like a historic event in India's contemporary history, that the government, the authoritarian government actually withdrew the laws on November 19th, 2021. That map I have put there is just for reference. It's from Trolley Times, one of the publications that I'm studying. It is just a map to one of the protest sites, and you will just see how you can just see the scale of the protest site. Just look at the infrastructure that was there. There were, of course, the protest sites. There were, of course, the spaces for protest. There were accommodation, makeshift accommodations. There were community kitchens. There were medical facilities. There were libraries. So, and I just like to draw your attention. I don't know if you're able to see it here, that there is a mention of the stage there. There were also, sorry, I just go back slide. There is a mention of the stage there, and that stage is the space where the coalition, kind of the SKM, used to coordinate the protest, address the protesters. And I will speak a bit about that in the later slides. So this is just to give a sense of the fact that the farm protests were not only taking place in Delhi, in the 4 locations around Delhi. It was, of course, in Delhi, and you can see that concentration there of around Delhi of the scale of events there. And there were also protests happening in solidarity across the country in different locations, different states. And that is just to give a sense of just the sheer number of people that were there at the protests. So I would like you to spend a few seconds looking at that picture there. So what we are seeing essentially is the large, a large section of how Indian mainstream media, how a large section of that actually portrayed the movement. There were labels of the farmers being terrorists, of being led by separatist forces, of being violent, of being rich, of being, the movement being led by, guided by rich farmers who were misguiding the others. So yeah. So what I see there is, of course, the what Tilly calls the built-in asymmetry between in the relationship between media and social movements, and how movements have no control over whether they will cover, whether the media will cover the movement, and if they do, they have no control over how it will be covered. So there is no. It also evokes features of the protest paradigm, Channon Lee and of course Johnson and Harlow, where media deploys strategies, mainstream media deploys strategies to delegitimize and demonize protests and protesters in various ways. There was, of course, invisibilization. So much of the protests that were happening around in different places was not given, did not receive much media coverage, nor did it receive until it became that big movement and became that large scale encampments. It converted into these townships. Media was pretty much not giving it attention. It's only when it became difficult to not give it attention that it actually started covering it. But then the quality of the kind of coverage was. And there was also a problem with homogenization, with refusing to, with an unwillingness to acknowledge the diversity in the protesters and the protests in terms of genders, in terms of languages, in terms of class and caste differences. So there was a kind of I mean, that's another thing, the protest paradigm is about that you give very superficial coverage to a movement. So you would see all of that. I will just take a few moments to give us, talk a bit about where that portrayal actually comes from and what's the state of the Indian mainstream media today. Since the 1990s, when India started its economic liberalization, Indian media has seen unprecedented corporatization. There is also, combined with concentration of media in ownership in a few hands. There is upper class domination in the newsrooms, which of course is seen in the way existing, social hierarchies, social inequalities are kind of reproduced even in the media. Co-optation of mainstream media has been particularly a problem, more so since 2014, since after this government was sworn in the first time. And as per the Center for Media Studies, rural India gets about 0.26% front page coverage for a population that makes up 70% of India's population. I mean, that 70% lives in the villages. So there's also been a trend of self-censorship in the media, which naturally is reflected in the. I skipped a few. Yeah, so India ranks 159 out of 180 in the World Press Freedom Index. So having said that context, I can get into my research now and my research questions. So I'm looking at, I'm keen to understand what communicative role did alternative media play in the Indian farmers' protests of 2020-21? How did they go about their tasks? So this literally means what are the processes, what are the strategies, what are the practices that they deployed to achieve their goals, and what are the distinctive characteristics of journalism practiced by these media? So what can we see as alternative in these practices? So those are kind of the questions that are guiding my research and that I'm looking to find answers for. So I'll just introduce you to the three publications, the alternative media publications I'm looking at. The first one is Karti Dharti, which was a woman in print publication. It called itself a newsletter that was started with the aim of providing the woman's perspective on the farmers' protest. It was published in Punjabi, printed and distributed in the protest sites. And the first three editions were translated into English and Hindi and uploaded online. Between February 2021 and April 2021, it published 5 editions before ceasing operations. It also had a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter presence. The first one is the screenshot of the front page of the first edition. That's the language is Punjabi. The second is Trolley Times. Trolley Times preceded Karti Dharti. It was also a print. It started in December of the month following the protest, the start of the protest. It was a print publication, called itself a newsletter, also emerged from the protest sites. It started publishing in December 2020 and printed its last copy soon after the laws were withdrawn. The print edition was bilingual. It was Hindi and Punjabi. It is representing the two major linguistic groups at the protest sites. The first few editions were translated into English. Thereafter, all editions were made available on a common drive from where volunteer translators anywhere could download, translate, and distribute. It also had its social media presence. The third one is People's Archive of Rural India, or PARI, which is a digital archive and journalism venture that started. It actually predates the movement itself. It started in 2017. So, but it has had a long engagement with rural India and has reported on in depth on the agrarian crisis, the ongoing agrarian crisis in India. And it had, during the farm movement, it had a dedicated page on its website with stories specifically for the protests. Sorry, I was trying to. I will also briefly dwell upon the differences in their locations in relation to the movement. Trolley Times and Karti Dharti emerged from the protest sites. However, neither of them were official media of the movement. They kept that, in the sense they declared a distance from the movement, and the Samyukt Kisan Morcha, which is the coalition. Both were set up and run by students, activists, young people who were connected to the cause because they either came from farm union backgrounds or were drawn to the movement because of their own politics, ideology, or motivations. While the publications never claimed to be official mouthpieces of the SKM or the movement, they did not hesitate to say that they were partisan towards the movement.
Yeah, we're recording.
Pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So yeah, so they had no hesitation in saying that they were partisan towards the movement. So. And People's Archive of Rural India, on the other hand, was already, like I said, a full-fledged online publication before the farmers started their protest. Yeah, and it has been actually covering, it has been providing ongoing coverage on the agrarian distress in India, the various issues faced by farming and farmers across the country, as well as the various farmer protests leading up to the mobilization of 2020-21. I mean, this was not a standalone event. There has been, even in recent past, there have been a few mobilizations which are quite large in scale. Like there was in 2018 in Mumbai, there was a march of farmers from Nashik to Mumbai. Thousands of farmers walked from Nashik to Mumbai, which is about 185 kilometers. So they walked that distance. So, and Pari has covered that, the whole process. So, in fact, this attention to the process and not just the event, the process leading up to the movement, and the ongoing engagement with the many issues that resulted in the event is one of the features of one of the alternative features that that was observed across the three publications. By contrast, mainstream media's attention seemed to be on the event rather than on the process, which also ties in with Tilley's description of media, social movements, and the role of the, worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment as being the WUNC factors to get media attention. So despite this, yeah. So mainstream media was either focusing on these factors or they were not. The focus was on the event. Here I also refer to the way Melucci has described movements as having periods of latency and visibility, each serving different functions and involving different temporalities. The alternative media that I'm studying here covered not just the protest or the event, but the processes that led up to the event, as well as the process that sustained the event. So how did the event sustain? How did the protest sustain for a whole year? The micro organizations within that were covered by the media. So for today, I'm just going to speak about the communicative, the aim or the purpose of the mediation that the thematic analysis reveals. Basically, it reveals two broad sets of communicative aims, one looking within the protest and the other looking outward. That said, the audiences cannot be neatly compartmentalized into mutually exclusive categories such as internal versus external, or protesters versus the outside world, rather than conceiving of the audiences as being separated by spatial boundaries. it would be more appropriate to think of them as groups of people either united by a cause or skeptical of it, regardless of where they were located. So those were the three kind of broad sets of aims. So there's mediating the collective, creating the counter narrative, and constructing the counter memory. So these are the three kind of themes that emerge from the analysis of the interviews and the content that was published. So in the interest of time and for today's presentation, I'm just going to explore the first role, which is mediating the collective. I think before getting into why the media, into the why of the media or the how of the mediating the collective, I think it's important to see what is this collective like, what is the diversity in the collective. So the farmers' protests of 2021 brought together people from across the agrarian classes, people from different states speaking different languages, and people from different class, caste, and gender locations. There were farmers, agricultural workers, men, women, children, youths, older people. And each of these groups had their own diversity. Farmers were not a homogeneous group. There were the richer farmers with large landholdings, which was indeed one of the narratives peddled by the government, that circulated by the government, that much of much of mainstream media, that it was a rich farmers movement. And there were small and marginal farmers. There were Adivasis, the indigenous communities. Dalits were the most oppressed in the caste hierarchy. The dominant caste and class, the Jats. There were farm unions with affiliations to different ideologies and religious identities. So what Moliner and Singh call a blend of Marxist ideology, Sikh values, and practices, and a popular culture of resistance, Sikh being the religion predominantly practiced in Punjab. So that is what required the mediation of the we building, basically, because of the sheer diversity in the protest groups. So I have just, you could take a minute to read these quotes if you would like. And these are just participants reflecting on why they set up the media. The first one talks about an interesting concept about bridging the gap between the stage and the protesters. Remember, I mentioned the gap, the stage in the map that I showed. So they saw that as a very important aspect of their work, to bridge the gap between the stage from where the leader spoke and the protesters. The second was looking at the movement through the people, so capturing the movement through the voices and experiences of the ordinary protesters, who were basically the spine of the protest. And in a sense, that second quote also talks about why they chose print, because they will bring those copies back to the villages, and then that the week keeps getting expanded. And then there is the third quote is about just the way that how one of the problems with mainstream portrayal of movements is also about homogenization, and that last quote talks about how it's so different and what are the sheer diversities in the groups of people. So the internal or movement-facing communicative role of mediating the collective manifested in the following communicative actions in the three media publications: building cohesion, mobilizing for the movement, motivating the movement, or building, expanding, and sustaining the we. So what does the analysis show? One metaphor used by many participants during my interviews was that of the last trolley, and this becomes a very powerful symbol for the movement. That picture there is of a trolley. Basically, to explain what a trolley is, there are these tractors to which you attach these trailers. Those are the trolleys. Yeah, and that became also dwellings. This is where people lived. Some of the protesters lived. So And participants describe how at one point on one of the border sites, they were the length of the protest, the trolley.
They are outside?
Yes, it was 16 kilometers on the highway.
Okay.
So that's how it was. And that last trolley basically for me symbolizes the most marginalized of the groups that were sitting in the protest site. It also means this distance from the leadership and the protester, and how does the message from the stage go to the last trolley, literally. So that comes across as a powerful kind of symbol throughout these conversations. So many participants, in fact, mentioned how they wanted to ensure that in the 16-kilometer lineup of trolleys on Delhi's borders, on the highways, everything discussed and communicated at the main stage from where the union leaders addressed the protesters was carried to the very last trolley. Another participant described his reporting as starting from the last trolley, as opposed to the mainstream journalists' engagement with the protest sites, beginning and ending with the first trolley. So again, talking about the alternative practices, I think I'm just referring to those practices as I speak. So the temporary but year-long urban settlement set up by protesters around Delhi had its own infrastructure, as Sadhana and Co 2022 say, with spaces for accommodation, community kitchens, libraries, and so on. Each of the protest sites also had stages set up by the farm unions, from where the movement leaders addressed the protesters. Bhuyan describes how the movement leadership carefully curated the speakers for these stages and turned them into sites from where to enact the development of consensus and solidarity building, and lay the foundation for the building of the collective. By maintaining control over the speakers and the cultural performances, she further notes, the leadership used the stages to turn the focus on agrarian and rural issues. Thus, the stage performed a role of educating and motivating the protesters and reinforcing the we. The stage audience setup, however, hints at a potential gap between the stage and the protesters. The farther one was from the stage, the greater the distance between the message and the recipient. This gap could have rendered the movement vulnerable to internal threats and factionalism. With the protesters coming from different political ideologies, different states, languages, caste class locations, and relationships that have had a fraught history, there was a danger of the fissures widening, and bridging this gap to coordinate the protest action and to create a cohesive protesting collective was a key aspect of the communicative action of the alternative media I'm researching. I just want to speak about the stage a bit more and what that means within the... Out of time already? I will wind this up. So if the protest sites were akin to townships, the stages could be compared to public squares, the space for announcements, discussions, and debate. The designated space for official discourse, however, suggests an asymmetry in the discursive power and the stage-protester relationship, a top-down structure that raises questions about the participatory potential of the discussion. What I'm suggesting here is the idea of multiple exclusions and marginalities that can complicate discursive and participatory parity within a social movement of the marginalized. Karti Dharti, for example, was set up in response to a fear that women's participation in the protest may be invisibilized and their voices may be silenced, or when they do speak, they may go unheard in the larger, louder discourse, the dominant discourse within the movement. So the efforts of the three publications may be viewed as a way of addressing the communicative imbalance between the stage and the protesters. As against the one-way flow of information and messages, the publications sought to create a space for the protesters to speak back to the SKM, the stage, and the other protesters. All three publications captured the protesters' experience and feelings about the protests in their own words and perspective, thus attempting to add plurality to the discourse and refusing to let the official version represented by the stage to be the only way of talking about the protests from within the movement space. So I will just quickly speak a bit about expanding the collective we. I referred to that earlier. So I have some some examples from the organization, from the 3 publications. The first shows you how, I mean, it's very layered. It talks about women in a different state, not in at the protest site, who are sending food and rations to the movement. So that's their contribution to the movement. So although they're not at the protest site, they're there. So that's also about making visible women's contribution to the movement, and also showing just the sheer spread of the movement beyond the spatial boundaries of the Delhi borders. The second story talks about how the laws will affect everyone. It's not just going to affect the farmers or those working in agriculture. It's also going to affect ordinary citizens of India. And the third one talks about people who had their own work or businesses around the protest sites, and how they were also supporting the movement despite great inconvenience to their daily lives. So communication is key to the expansion of the collective we, allowing it to connect with those who share the emotional and affective space created by the movement. It facilitates building of solidarities with supporters who may not occupy the physical spaces of the movement, but share the cause and the values that the movement stands for. As mentioned earlier, the SKM orchestrated this sense of the collective in the farmers' protests by creating common frames for the protesters, by coordinating protests across the country in support of the protests in Delhi, and by rallying support from citizen groups. The 3 alternative media publications' mediation of the collective we mirrored some of these frames, but also went beyond. The movement was much larger than, as they showed through their articles, was much larger than the event taking place at Delhi's borders. The movement was also constituted of individuals and groups that did not physically join the protests, but gave their labor to make it possible. From the women who stayed back in their homes to tend to the farms and the family so that men could be at the protest sites, to the women who fed the resistance by sending food and rations to the protest sites, and the farmers and farm workers who traveled all the way from the villages of different states to the cities to sit in protest in support of the larger protest. Okay, I will quickly skip through this. I just want to share a metaphor that a participant used to describe their role in the ongoing process of formation and expansion of the we. That of someone looking at the protest through the window of the car, interested, curious, even empathetic, but not sure if they would like to roll down the window. And the media's role, they said, was to persuade this person on the other side of the glass to change their perspective so the glass roll comes down. So this relentless work on the boundaries that divide people with a view to expand the collective and foster solidarities across different boundaries was a characteristic of all 3 media cases in my research. I think I just want to quickly talk about how social media movement scholarship has warned about the risks of homogenization inherent in the process of the construction of collective identities, such as the elision of diversity and the inability of individual identities to fit within or accept fully the labels associated with the collective identity. I refer to Gabado, Jasper, and McGarry here. Homogenized view of the movement renders invisible the many identities that constitute the movement and disregards the constant tensions that a movement faces and negotiates from within. So the women's fight for visibility, the Dalit work protesters fight for their causes. So they all brought their own individual struggles to this larger struggle. I also speak about the boundary formation within the collective. So there is also creating boundaries within these groups, and that while being within the larger collective, and how these are in a permanent state of tension and working together. And I think I will. So what I'm trying to say is that they work at the boundaries and try to blur the boundaries, but at the same time, they also respect, recognize, acknowledge the boundaries and speak about them. The last bit is about voice, and this comes across very strongly in all my text and the interview transcripts is, and the way they say it, like Karti Dharti says, it's a woman-led publication to create a space for diverse voices from the farmers' movement, and they all express their they all talk about voice differently. PARI reports from these protest sites show that while farmers or groups may have individual or location-specific concerns, they all speak in a collective voice. So you have the individual, diverse voice, you have the collective voice, and you have Trolley Times saying it's the voice of the Kisan protest. So this, I think what I'm trying to say is that entangled in these are ideas of voices as spoken, silenced, heard, and unheard. This absolutely, I promise, my last slide. I'm just going to speak a bit about voice and how that was quite central to the journalism of the three media that I'm studying. And how it manifested in the interviews and the content. I think here I want to reference how Coldry spoke about the relationship between voice and alternative media, and how that offers an approach that looks at the concept of voice as a process and voice as process and voice as a value, with the former referring to the capacity of people to make their make and articulate stories about their own lives and experiences, and the latter referring to the conditions under which this voice is effective or allowed to be effective and valued or heard. Looking at voice as value thus draws attention to the structural barriers to the process of being heard and the frameworks of social, economic, and political organization that undermine voice. And this is a powerful way of exploring the different structures that enable or block access to the process of voice, the asymmetry in voices that becomes evident in who gets to participate in the process of voice and which voice is assigned value. And I think I'm trying to I'm referring here to how different voices within the movement, the relationship between them and what was heard, what was allowed to be spoken, what got heard. Yeah, I think Coldry also spoke about voice being that recognition of voice being fundamental to the principle of the value of voice. Although I should say that lastly that I'm also very, I think I'm currently engaging with this idea of giving voice to the voiceless that you refer to, and also the fact that you speak about the falsely consensual nature of this process of giving the word, and that's something I'm also trying to understand within the discussion on alternative media, and the fact that none of these three publications look at the protesters being voiceless. They acknowledge that they have voice and that their stories are valid and that they need to be told. So this idea of not just voice, but of also listening as a practice in alternative journalism is something that comes, that all voices are valid. And so, so listening not just as an act of the audience, but listening as an act of the media. That's something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Sangeeta, for your presentation, very complete presentation. And I was thinking about a kind of title about for your, next article or something, and maybe listening to the last trolley could be a good one, maybe. Because I was thinking in giving voice to the last trolley, but I think that what you concluded with was more about listening to, right? So I will quickly ask 6 questions. So you don't have to answer them now because I don't think we'll have time to listen to all the answers, but maybe it could be a way to think about in the next month because you're going to start to write your PhD dissertation. So my first question is about what you started with, the fact that you're both a journalist engaged in an alternative publication and a researcher working on this alternative media linked with the social movement in India. So my question will be, how do you combine your position as a researcher on the one hand and as an engaged person and professional journalist on the other end? What do you do with auto-reflexivity, and how do you analyze your own position? How do you explain that you've been conducted to study such a movement and to be interested in exploring how such marginalized and subaltern voices and groups can find their way into the, being seen their voice published and listened to? So that's one set of questions. The second one deals with the political strategy of the movement you're studying. I was wondering if you had tried to document the strategic discussion among the leaders about what would be the best strategy, like having a violent strategy, for example, or non-violent strategy. Was it a question at the moment or not? Because it can be sometimes the answer to the question, how do we do it? So is it an obvious, and is it a non-question? Is it like if I have my own stereotypes on India, like how the Gandhi tradition is pursuing through history? And also, is the occupation of places been something that went on the way of the protest, or that had been something in the mind of protesters in the beginning, like occupying a central place in Delhi, and instead of that, they occupy a peripheral place of the city? So that's the question, and this question is linked with something very central in your study, which is the relationship between the leaders and the protesters from the basis, the last trolley, as you said. I would like to understand how you measure to what extent alternative media contributed to the construction and mobilization of consensus within the movement. This is the title of a famous article by Bert Klandermans, the construction and mobilization of consensus. And in this article, Bert Klandermans underlined the fact that social movement media do not have a crucial role within movement, because basically they only serve to maintain a consensus among people who are already convinced about the legitimacy of the cause they defend. So would you say that alternative media are playing a role of something else, another function that is underestimated by Bert Klandermans, or is it just a role as a ciment? I don't know how to say that, like something to to glue people together. And linked with this question is the question of the mainstream media coverage a political question within the movement? And if yes, is it a question addressed more by the leaders or also by basic activists? And to what extent does it contribute to the coalition of such a diverse and geographically dispersed movement? So as an external negative factor, it can help to construct, to build a consensus more strongly than the alternative media you're studying. Maybe as an external factor, it plays a major role than alternative media themselves. So maybe it's a way to, to think the process on the other side. Okay. And then could you maybe explain us if these three media you choose to study are the only three alternative media of the movement, or if there are other ones, and if there are other ones, why do you choose these ones specifically rather than other media? For example, official propaganda means used by the leaders as a way to produce and diffuse the official message of the movement and precisely to build from above the consensus? Were there discussions over the legitimacy of this media to, are they really building a consensus, or on the contrary, from the leaders' point of view, factors of division among the activists, because precisely they show that there are divisions and boundaries within the movement and internal hierarchies where leaders have a natural tendency to, say that the movement is worthy, unified, united, committed. It's a model by Charles T. Wunk model, worthy, united, numerous, and committed. So alternative media tend to show that it's, not that united, sometimes not that worthy, because, winter is difficult and summer also, and you have people with disease, and you have dead people, and you have discouragement during so there are saying a lot of things that can break the effort of the leaders to build a consensus among a very large movement and a very long-term movement. Last two questions. Sorry, I have a lot of questions. You're trying to combine three variables: the class variable, the caste variable, and the gender variable. How, methodologically speaking, do you reach to measure the respective role of class, gender, and caste in the internal relationship of power of the movement, and eventually on the reception of the movement outside? And this is my last question. What kind of things do you think such kind of study can bring to alternative media studies on the one hand, because there are numerous studies on social media movements? So what's new here? What kind of new things can you teach us through this study? What kind of thing can you teach us about sociology of social movement? And you spoke about the political process paradigm. So what kind of new things can you tell us about this paradigm crossing, the structure of political opportunity, the injustice frames, and the collective action repertoire? And maybe on media sociology, what can it bring to how to understand media processes? And maybe something that came to my mind listening to you, does it tell us something about the logic of political representation in the large sense of the term? I think it's a great enlightenment on what representing a group means, right? That's it. Thank you.
Do you have questions? Should I?
Yeah, I think we should ask the question and then discuss it informally.
Yes, I have few, but I one more. Yeah, you talk about the role of memory work carried out by alternative media, and within your corpus there are publications from the protest sites, which were not only places of occupation but also hubs of cultural creation, popular education, political expression. A lot of show. Are there any effort to turn these spaces into places of memory? Do the alternative media that were involved in the Kaizen and the land see themselves as participants in the political representation of the sites of struggles? And if yes, how? And how they justify their action in the struggle? And a second question. Among the three publications you are studying, do you observe any differences in how the information on the social movement are framed? If so, what are the nature of these differences, and based on which variable do you analyze them? So just my two questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I propose that we stop here, unfortunately, and your PhD will maybe a place where we find the answer to all these questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta, for your presentation.
For going over
Don't
time.
worry.